Hi, we're here with week 4 lecture. This lecture goes along with the book and the other assignments. This is not a replacement for that, but it's a supplement to that. So make sure you study all the other materials as well. So what we're going to talk about today is medical exams, drug testing, and then some policies that would normally be prohibited by different statutory laws that prohibit discrimination, but that there's what's called bona fide occupational qualifications that would allow for certain discrimination in those circumstances. So let's get started with the lecture. So what we're going to talk about now is medical exams, and it's not real clear under the law often what is and what is not a medical exam. And some of this is just something you have to memorize. And what you're really going to be focused on is, what should draw your attention to this could be possibly a medical exam, and then what laws would implicate that if it is. And you can go, research that to determine if it is or is not. The definition of a medical exam that's provided is any procedure or test that seeks information about an individual's impairment or health. And that is not a very helpful definition. It's a good baseline, but it doesn't really tell you what is and is not covered. And why it matters is because if they are covered, if something's considered a, quote, medical exam, end quote, then the exam and its results are covered by the ADA. And the Americans with Disabilities Act, also known as the ADA, will limit what you can and cannot do and when you can and cannot take and ask for a medical exam. And also, once you do such a medical exam, the results of that should not be stored in the personnel file. They should be stored in a separate file because that information is subject to HIPAA and certain confidentiality laws that does not allow it to be contained within the employee's personnel file. If something is a medical exam, then you're not allowed to perform the medical exam until there's a conditional offer of employment. And once there's a conditional offer of employment, employers can perform the medical exam and test, and there are no limitations on such a post-offer pre-employment medical exam. It can be tests for physical or mental issues, and they do not have to be job related. One of the reasons why, even if it wasn't the law, that you could not do a medical exam with respect to the hiring of a new person until an offer has already been made would also be the cost, because they're a medical exam has certain costs that goes along with it. And so you wouldn't want to be doing that on every applicant that applied because it would be cost prohibitive. But once you've narrowed the selection, made an offer, you can then, after you made the offer, have a post-offer pre-employment medical exam, and it is not limited to the scope of the exam. You can look into anything on that. The reason why they do this is because if you don't make a decision, they'll be very clear why you didn't make the decision to hire them. And you have to accommodate disabilities that are revealed in a medical exam if they're possible to accommodate and won't cause a substantial burden and undue hardship on the employer. And so it's very easy under the ADA to determine whether that's the reason why someone wasn't hired, because it would be the last thing in the hiring process, because you've already made them an offer and it's conditioned on passing the medical exam. Now, for current employees, we have a different scenario in which you can still do medical exams and you can do them throughout employment after they've been hired, but the scope of a medical exam for a current employee has to be job related and consistent with the business necessity of that particular job. And so pre-employment, no limitation on the scope. Current employees, there's a limitation on the scope, and it has to be related to the job for which they are performing for you, or if they're going to be getting a promotion or a different type of job, it would have to be related to the particulars of that job because they're already a current employee. There's also a thing that you could do is called wellness testing. Wellness testing is something that employers do, but it has to be voluntary. And a lot of medical plans will say that if you do a wellness testing and do certain checkups, then you can get certain discounts on your insurance. Those have to be 100% voluntary. If not, they will violate the ADA because it's definitely a medical exam and it's not related to the job that's being performed. If you offer incentives, and an employer offers incentives for people to participate in wellness testing, then you also have to offer those same incentives to people who are unwilling to do it via an alternative method. For example, if you said that if you're willing to stop smoking, you'll get a discount on your insurance, then you also have to offer that discount to people who are willing to maybe not stop smoking, but are also willing to take classes on the negative impacts of tobacco or something like that. All right, table 6.1 is a good table. It's on page 258 of the book, and it gives you examples of things that are medical exams and things that are not. And some of them, most of the ones that are medical exams, make sense to and you would easily fall within the definition, like blood pressure screening or HIV tests, certain genetic tests, or diagnostic testing procedures. What one I think is always a little bit confusing for most people is a test to check for use of alcohol is a medical exam, whereas a drug test to search for use of illegal drugs is not a medical exam. And there's really not an easy explanation for that, but that is what the law has developed, and it's just you have to memorize the difference between those. Physical fitness and agility tests are not considered medical exams, and that's just your ability to do the job and do the task. So if you're interested, take a look at this chart, and this will help you kind of determine what is and is not, but will also show you that it's not as easy as you would think, that certain things are medical exams and certain things are not. For example, the difference between the testing for illegal drugs and testing for alcohol. Drug testing, as we just talked about, is not a medical exam, and that allows employers to drug test their employees. But if you're, and that's drug testing for illegal drugs. If you are testing for prescription drugs, then that would be considered a medical exam. Now, if certain employees have a reason, because let's say they're a forklift operator or drive some kind of vehicle for you, then you could test for prescription drugs that may cause sleepiness or some kind of other side effect, because that would be a medical exam, but it would be reasonably related to the job necessity and the duties they are performing with you. Alcohol, as we just talked about, testing is a medical exam. If employers are not required to drug test, but many employers do drug test. The exception to that is if you have a safety sensitive position or something that's subject to the DOT, Department of Transportation, you are required to drug test people with like commercial driver's license, pilots and things like that, bus drivers, train operators and things like that, because they are subject to mandatory drug testing because of the types of jobs that they do and the safety sensitive nature of those jobs. Most employers in the private sector, they're not required to drug test, but many do. There's basically 3 or 4 times where most employers would drug test. One would be pre-employment drug screening. One would be post-accident drug screening. Another one would be reasonable suspicion. And then the last would be random in drug testing. And if you typically, what employers will do is if they're going to engage in one of those 4 methods of drug testing, they will explain and should have policies and procedures of when they drug test and explain that to the employees and allow them to know that, and then have policies and procedures around that to ensure consistent application of the drug testing policies and procedures. What should be in those policies is what types of testing the company is going to do, whether it's random, pre-employment, post-accident, reasonable suspicion, which of those they're going to do. When you do it, you need to respect the employee's privacy with respect to that, and that includes in administering the drug test as well as the results of the drug test. The best practice is to use a third-party testing service. I would never suggest that you administer drug tests yourself. You need to hire a third party and have a third-party service to do that. Ask them to utilize what's called a medical review officer. That is someone who looks at the results of the drug test and then contacts the employee and seeks any explanation, or do they have any prescriptions for certain drugs that would cause them to test positive if there is a positive test. Another thing that you would have in that, and the reason why you have the medical review officer is because that's a third party, and if they're asking questions about some kind of prescription drug that they may be taking, then the company's not going to have knowledge of that condition or that disability that the person may have. And so the medical review officer keeps an extra level of between the employee and their condition to the employer. And then make sure that you have a consistent application of the process and procedure as you go through it. If someone is found to be have a positive test, and then the company needs to decide, do they have a zero tolerance, and everybody who has a positive test is terminated, or do you have some kind of policy there that allows people to get certain treatment and then come back? And you need to think about that and which one you're going to employ with respect to it. A thing that has complicated drug testing in the past 5 years or so is all the medical marijuana that has been allowed, and then recreational marijuana in certain states. Certain states have prohibited companies from testing for marijuana at all. However, if it's somebody who is subject to the Department of Transportation regulations, those laws don't apply, and you can still test and terminate for marijuana usage at those safety sensitive level positions. But other states, and many states, not Texas, have come in and said you can't even test for medical marijuana, or any marijuana testing. And so you have to keep an eye on that and check, because each state's going to be different on what you can and can't test for, especially with respect to marijuana and the effects of that and what you can do with the results of those testing. Now, again, federal law, marijuana is still illegal, and if you have a Department of Transportation testing, none of those state laws will control. All right, moving on to facially discriminatory policies and practices. Employers, as we've talked about or will talk about, are prohibited from making hiring decisions based on protected classes. There are an exception to that, which is called the bona fide occupational qualification. And there are three major exceptions to that, and it comes into authenticity, public safety, and privacy. And if a job requires a certain protected class, let's say you're hiring for a particular theatrical role or movie role, and you need to hire someone that's young for that role, well, that could violate the Age Discrimination in Employment Act. But as to the authenticity, if you need a young actor to do a particular role, you have to do that. And so they say because of the authenticity of the position that's needed for that theatrical or movie role, you can have a bona fide occupational qualification that there's no way to hire that role without otherwise discriminating against someone. Another example is public safety. And in public safety, that would be positions that you're not really seeking to hire men necessarily, but if you look at your firefighters, typically the firefighters are male because firefighters have to be able to carry people out of buildings and do certain things like that. So there's some qualifications there on physical strength and lifting requirements. And so those would really have a disparate impact, not because you're not making a decision based on male or female, but because those physical traits may be needed to do that job, then it would have a disparate impact on conceivably, possibly women, or it would. And so you can, if you have a bona fide occupational qualification, the idea is for public safety, we need to require this certain level of strength requirements, then you can go ahead and make decisions based on that because there's no other way around it to hire in a less discriminatory manner. And then the last would be privacy concerns. And so if you are hiring for a locker room attendant for the women's locker room, you're going to hire a female, and there's no other way to do that. And so that would be a bona fide occupational qualification. What you can't do, and a lot of people try to use a bona fide occupational qualification to, or a BFOQ, with respect to, certain types of positions, like a hostess at a restaurant or certain wait staff if you're only going to hire women. That would not satisfy the bona fide occupational qualification. And they say, well, that's what our customers want. And that is not a bona fide occupational qualification customer desires. It is, is the job really require the person to be a certain protected class? And those cases typically only will fall into the categories here: authenticity, public safety, or privacy. And that is the end of lecture 4, or week 4. And make sure you continue to read the other materials and other assignments so that you'll have a good grasp of all the materials for the test and quizzes. Thank you.